Hello, Peter Cox here. Again, nice to see you. Together with Mark Thomas, who is, as you will know by now, the author of 99%, the instigator of the 99% organisation movement based around the ideas in his books. Mark, I want to ask you about democracy. It feels increasingly under threat from all kinds of things. How concerned are you about it specifically here in the UK?
Well, I am very concerned because although we have a history of being a well-functioning democracy, we don't have a written constitution, and a lot of the things that act as checks and balances on the power of a prime minister and the cabinet are not actually codified, and it's just accepted that these things will people will behave in certain ways.
It's convention, isn't it? I mean, that's you know, when I learned a little bit about this at school decades ago, that's what they said. They said, you know, the beauty of the British Constitution is it's unwritten, which means that we're all good chaps. I think emphasis on the word chaps, and nobody would do anything silly and take advantage of the fact that there's actually nothing written down there. There are no rules to break, actually, no written rules. But that's kind of changing now.
Well, it's not quite true, I think, to say that there are no written rules, but we don't have a comprehensive written constitution. Right. And I certainly agree with the second part, which is that that's changing. We've got people who think that rules are there to be broken. And therefore, those parts which are purely convention are really under threat at the moment. So, you know, we have in theory a nice system with lots of checks and balances, and in the past it has worked pretty well. And so, you know, it might be frustrating if you're in government because you want to do something and then you find you're blocked by this or you're blocked by that. And of course, you know, people always assume that they're right. So the people who are blocking
they always know best, don't they, these people?
Exactly. Yeah. We all do that. You know, we all think our own opinions are right, otherwise we wouldn't hold them. But if you're in a position of power and you believe you're right on everything and you believe that nobody should be challenging you, that gets very dangerous. So it's really important that we have a well-functioning set of checks and balances in place, and we have had.
We've got this interesting diagram that's straight out of your book, actually. Let's just spend a few moments looking at it because it explains, I think, very clearly how the system works, is supposed to work. Just talk us through it, if you don't mind, Mark.
Well, the most fundamental part of it is that we are a democracy. And what that means is if we don't like the government, we can sack them. So voters elect MPs. MPs select actually the prime minister and the government. And then the government proposes laws which are scrutinised by Parliament, and assuming they get through Parliament, then the civil service enacts them, and that produces certain outcomes in the world and has effects on people. And if those outcomes are in line with the kind of contract that was there in the manifesto, people say, yes, they've delivered against their promises, we're happy, we'll re-elect them, and you go round and round and round. But just in case that doesn't work, there are all sorts of checks and balances built in. So actually, Parliament is in itself a check and a balance, and we've seen recently the House of Lords has been an effective so far check and balance against some of the worst ideas that the government has come up with.
Let's just mention that for a moment before we come back to the way the system is supposed to function and whether it is functioning or not. House of Lords, these are two things that I think people find incredibly dull. One is the House of Lords, and the other is this thing that you referred to just now, called the Internal Market Bill. That sounds like so boring. But both of those things together are actually rather dynamic at the moment, aren't they?
Well, they're very dynamic. That Internal Market Bill, you remember, it's part of the process of getting ready for Brexit. And the idea is to make sure that there won't be barriers within the UK, that, for example, England and Scotland will be able to trade, but perhaps most importantly, England and Northern Ireland will be able to trade seamlessly. The problem, there are two problems with the bill. One is that actually it goes against some of the provisions in the withdrawal agreement and the Good Friday Agreement, so that if they were to implement it and take all the powers that they would have given themselves, peace in Northern Ireland would be under threat. And the House of Lords has picked up this point explicitly. But the other point is at least as fundamental, which is that it's a real attack on the rule of law. It's an attack on some of these checks and balances. So, for example, if it were to go through without any amendments, it would say that the powers under that bill would not be subject to judicial review. So the government could then behave in a way that is, in other senses, illegal, but because of this bill being itself beyond scrutiny, those acts are not in scrutiny. And of course, if you do that for one bill, you could do it for other bills as well. So you could essentially set up a whole series of legislation which gave you enormous powers which couldn't be challenged.
Again, I mean, so this is not the first time I've said this. I mean, I'm probably getting quite dull, actually, but sort of repeating this. But this is not what people voted for. You know, if you voted for Brexit, you voted for independence, to bring legislation back, make it more of a democracy, grassroots, all the rest of that. What I'm hearing from you, Mark, is that actually is the very opposite of what they're doing.
Well, yes, and I have to say the Tories ran a very clever campaign, because they said before the last election, they said all the sorts of things that you have been saying, but they wrote down in the manifesto all the sorts of things that I've been saying. So really? They did actually threaten in the small print that they would take a look at judicial review, and they would take a look at the rights of organizations to protest, and all manner of these things were not explicitly spelled out. But
silly me for not reading a 150-page manifesto before I voted, and millions of other people too.
Yeah. But what you should have been reading is the 99% website, because we did have an article on that very point that highlighted precisely those dangers. It also, despite the fact that they were promising to spend before the election, it also had in there some weasel words that would allow them to cut if and when they want to, because it talked about balancing the books and all these other nonsenses that we've covered in some of the other sessions.
That I've learnt about through listening to you. So let's go back to this diagram here, which is a good analysis, really, of how things are supposed to work. And go on.
Yeah, we just take a few examples. So we talked about the courts. You know, we saw quite recently how important it is that the courts can challenge the government when the government tried illegally to prorogue Parliament because they didn't want parliamentary scrutiny. And the Good Law Project took the government to court and argued, I thought very convincingly, that if they were allowed to prorogue Parliament whenever they liked, they could prorogue the day after the election, they could reconvene Parliament the day before, and they could operate without parliamentary scrutiny for the entire term. And luckily, their lordships found that that was not an acceptable way to behave. So the power of judicial review to stop what could ultimately become dictatorial behavior is a very, very important safeguard. But that one's under threat at the moment. The House of Lords, the powers of the House of Lords are under threat, and the composition more so, because they've talked about stuffing the House of Lords with what they've called Brexit heroes, which would be, in other words, people who would be loyal to whatever the government says. You've seen a sort of clear out of a lot of the top talent within the civil service, which both makes it harder because they've lost so much skill and experience. Some hugely experienced civil servants have gone.
Well, there's this is a great time for them to go, isn't it? We've only got, Brexit negotiations to deal with, and COVID, and the consequences of Brexit. I mean, we're not going to need good managers at all over the next 6 months, are we?
Well, exactly. But also it's even worse than that, because, they have very talented people in the less senior ranks, not so experienced, but just as talented. But if your boss has just been fired because he dared to argue with Dominic Cummings, or dared to point out to Michael Gove that his latest pet theory might not actually work, you've been promoted to that position, and they come up with another daft idea. Do you say no, Minister, or do you say yes, Minister, and do your best to make this hopeless idea
do you want a job or not? Basically, very simple.
Yeah.
Let's just go back to your diagram and look at things. This is how it's supposed to work, right?
This is how it's supposed to work, and I won't go through every single point here, but let's take peaceful protesters. That's an interesting one, because in the last couple of years, Extinction Rebellion has successfully raised the profile of the climate emergency, and indeed, the phrase climate emergency is now something which most governments recognise.
Absolutely,
and that was, it's hard to say for certain, but I think between them, Greta Thunberg and Extinction Rebellion are probably responsible. So peaceful protest is what has made that very, very important recognition come into government policy in many governments around the world. But this government has talked about making Extinction Rebellion considering as a crime, or an organised crime organisation,
terrorist organisation. Yeah, I mean, this is. I don't know. So, I can't think of anyone who has slightly libertarian tendencies who can support what's going on. I really can't. I mean, I can understand people of the fascist persuasion thinking that this is a good idea, but if you are right of centre and you've got libertarian tendencies, why would you support these things now?
Well, I think if you're a fundamentalist, you just think that anything that's an obstacle has to be got rid of. And
right.
It's clear they talk about moving fast and breaking things, which I think is Facebook's motto. But you've heard people in government adopting that mindset. Yes, we might break things. We might break the Constitution. We might break all manner of things, but that's the point. We want to upset the apple cart. We want to create a new order of things.
So let's just have a look at how they're breaking things. Okay, so this is how things are supposed to operate, and this is what's under threat, correct?
This is exactly. These are the things which are under threat. So, do we have a free press? Well, in a sense, it's free, but it's actually controlled, as we saw the graph the other day, almost entirely by offshore billionaires who have market fundamentalist tendencies. So that's not really effective for us. We have seen the civil service being attacked, and therefore not in the position to provide the kind of advice that they would normally provide. The courts are under attack. We talked about that. Whistleblowers are under attack. Peaceful protesters are under attack. Even voters, their ability to vote is under attack, because if you have an election where one side is able to deploy what in effect are psychological operations techniques against the voting population and convince them, surround vulnerable voters with a wall of misinformation so that, of course, they will vote according to the information they see. And if everywhere they look, they see information that says your life is terrible because the EU is destroying it, then if you hear nothing else for 2 years and then there's a referendum, of course you're likely to vote that way. It's not irrational.
That's what's happened.
It's a rational response to misinformation.
Downing Street has the psychological warfare unit. It has done for some time, hasn't it? It's the nudge
Absolutely.
unit. And Mr. Cummings' victory really was predicated on that. It was predicated on behavioural science and data mining, and he just did it a lot better than anybody else. But the fact is, we've been manipulated into this.
Oh, absolutely, yes. And it wasn't just him. The role of Cambridge Analytica and some of these associated organizations was highlighted by, among others, Carol Cadwallader, who did some very good research into that. And it's pretty scary stuff. It really is like declaring, applying military-grade psyops onto your own population. So even that most fundamental of checks and balances, the ability to have a free and fair election, even that's under threat.
Okay. So look, if you want to do something about it, have a look at Mark's book, 99%. It's on Kindle right now, and paperback too, and share it. I think that's the most important thing, actually, because although they may deploy, centralized psychological warfare weapons, how can we even be saying that in a democracy such as Britain? Although they may be doing that, they can't control what you say to your friends and neighbours. So please share the book, and please leave any comments and questions for Mark, even for me, but I won't be able to answer. Maybe I can tell you about my shirt or something like that in the comment here, and we'll see you tomorrow.